In our third and final special episode, which will be out just before the 110th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme, we're ending on the southern sector of the Somme battlefields for the 1st of July 1916. This takes us into the ground between the villages of Mametz and Montauban, where unlike most other parts of the battlefield that day, there were some successful outcomes. These episodes are only an overview of each of these Somme sectors, but hopefully they've been interesting in this anniversary period and inspired you to find out more, read some books, and perhaps visit the ground. In that respect, again, in this episode, it's important to mention Jonathan Porter's 0 Hour Z-Day books. Just amazing volumes packed full of photographs, maps, air images. I mean, they are absolutely essential to your understanding, your in-depth understanding of the Somme battlefields today. And there is one of them which covers this area of Mametz to Montauban in some detail, far more detail than we can do here. And I can't recommend these books enough. The link will be in the show notes, as with the previous episode. In addition, the POWs books by Pen and Sword, again, cover units that are part of this story, including the Liverpool and Manchester POWs. The Battleground Europe books cover this area well too, and there's a good divisional history of the 7th Division, which goes into some detail about the attack on Mametz. And on the Old Front Line YouTube channel, we've got films covering the Devonshire Cemetery, part of this story, and also a recent one just uploaded looking at the POWs at Montauban on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. So do check those out on the YouTube channel as well. But for now, let's begin. The small village of Mametz, or Mamet as the French call it, was located just north of the Albert-Peronne road on rising ground that looked to another ridgeline to the south. It was quite a complicated battlefield, as from the direction of neighbouring Fricourt, the front lines rose up the ridge there to the wooded area of the Bois Français, French wood, with both lines very close in this sector due to mining operations earlier in the conflict. And then it dropped again down to a gully and a small wooded area called Mansell Copse on the British trench maps, where the front line crossed the Peronne Road and headed in the direction of the next village, Connoy, and the British trenches face Mametz itself on this rising ground. The position of the village gave any defender an advantage in holding that ground, looking up towards the Bois Français and across to Mansell Copse and the British trenches near to the Peronne Road. Beyond the village itself was a long valley which headed towards Contalmaison, the next village to the north, and again in one of these valleys, so typical of that chalk landscape of the Somme, was the beginning of a wooded area in this part of the Somme battlefields, with Mametz Wood being one of the larger woods in this area. The main line of defence was around Mametz village itself, but beyond it there was a fallback position, a trench between Contalmaison and Mametz Wood, although the wood itself was a bivouac area for the Germans and not really part of their defence in depth. Even when that was eventually attacked a few weeks later, there wasn't a proper trench system within it. The sector here was part of the 15th Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Henry Horn, so connected to the assault on Fricourt that we spoke about in the previous episode. And the units within it were all part of the same formation, that 15th Corps, a grouping of divisions which evolved over time. Horn, who would go on to be an army commander by 1918, was a former gunner and had served in both France and Gallipoli, and his headquarters for this battle was back in the village of Hailly, Ailly, but he came forward obviously to observe what was happening much nearer to the front. At Fricourt, all of these attacking divisions had been new army formations, but here at Mametz, it was a regular army division that would make that attack, the 7th Division. So who were the 7th Division? Well, this was a unit that was created in 1914 when battalions of the British Empire that were in the far-flung corners of that empire were brought back to Britain, formed into this new formation, And in October 1914, the 7th Division was the last of the British divisions to arrive in Belgium in time for the First Battle of Ypres. It landed at Zeebrugge, marched down into Flanders, and then fought in the battles around Ypres in October and November of 1914, suffering a lot of casualties along the way. It then held the line, moved into northern France, and was involved in a lot of the offensives along that so-called Forgotten Front, as we call it today, in 1915, including the Battle of Loos. But in 1915, some of its regular units were removed from the division and sent to other formations and replaced with new army battalions. So in time for Loos, the 8th and 9th Devons joined the division, for example, and went over the top in the battle there in September of 1915. And in late that year, the 20th, 21st, 22nd and 24th Manchester Powers joined them. And the 24th Manchester, in fact, was an Oldham battalion and would become the Divisional Pioneer Battalion and known as the Oldham Pioneers. So it kind of changed in terms of its composition. It changed, its identity changed. And by the time of the Battle of the Somme, there's as many new army men, volunteers, in some cases POWs, as with the Manchester battalions, as there are some of the regulars who are surviving from those earlier battles. Because men wounded in 1914-15 may well have returned in time to take part in the Somme in that summer of 1916. One of the units in the division was the 1st Battalion, the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and they left a legacy of accounts, really, of the Somme front from two of the great war poets, Robert Graves and Siegfried Sassoon, who served in that battalion, and also Bernard Adams, a lesser-known figure who wrote Nothing of Importance, a book published in 1917, and gives the kind of day-to-day account of the lead-ups to the Somme. But 1st Royal Welsh Fusiliers would not be part of the main assault here. They would be in reserve on the first day of the Somme, and by the time of the Somme, Adams had been wounded and was recovering from those wounds. Graves had moved on to the 2nd Battalion Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and only Sassoon remained with the battalion. Opposite the British in this sector was Reserve Infantry Regiment No. 109, part of the 28th Reserve Division of the German Army, and a unit drawn from the Grand Duchy of Baden, with men drawn from towns like Karlsruhe and Bruchsal, for example. They'd been on the Somme since September of 1914, so were Somme veterans, really, who had fought the French, raided the British, and knew the ground here well. They had a dense network of trenches, deep dugouts, and well-sighted mortar and machine gun positions, and the geography of the battlefield here gave them the advantage in terms of placing those weapons to be able to lay down the maximum amount of fire and kill any potential enemy that moved out into the open in no man's land. The 7th Divisional task in the assault here against them was to capture the village of Mametz, clear the grounds beyond the Willow Stream, which separated Mametz from the neighbouring sector at Fricourt, then move to positions overlooking Mametz Wood. The ground rises to a crest there, and you can see down towards the wood, reach that position, and you can dominate the wood itself and the ground beyond, link up with the units advancing from Fricourt and those from other sectors advancing on Contal-Maison to the north, and then the high ground above the wood would offer good observation to beat off any German counter-attacks, and then reserve units would pass through them and continue with the general advance towards places like Caterpillar Valley, Bazentin, Longueval and Ginchy. The preparatory bombardment here reached a crescendo about an hour before the assault and was assisted by Stokes mortars firing at very close range. The mortars would often be implemented from saps, Russian saps, tunnelled underneath no man's land, and the mortars would pop out at the far end essentially and lay down fire at close range, often with devastating effect. Smoke was also used as at Fricourt, and tunnellers from the Royal Engineers blew a 2,000-pound charge under Bulgar Point, which was a strong point southeast of the village of Mametz, and some smaller charges were also blown in other key locations. A kind of a rolling, creeping barrage, an early version of it, was used, which the infantry would essentially follow across the ground to be assaulted, although how that worked exactly with the infantry was still in its infancy and open to problems in practice. The wire cutting in this sector compared to other parts of the line on the first day of the Somme was generally very good. Shrapnel was used to fire above the wire, rain down with shrapnel balls, and it would essentially chop the shrapnel off of its mounts, off of the stakes or off of the barbed wire pickets, whichever it was. And the greater concentration of artillery in this area seems to have destroyed far more targets than other sectors, including the Germans' own field gun positions, which meant that their ability to reply with artillery fire as they saw an enemy move out into no man's land at 0 hour was limited because the guns had been destroyed or put out of action. The units in the main British assault at Mametz would attack on a front of about 1,800 yards, from the Carnoy Road on the right across to a quarry south of Hidden Wood on the left. The 20th Brigade were on the left, with the 22nd Brigade behind them, and among them was Siegfried Sassoon in the 1st Battalion Royal Welsh Fusiliers, who had witnessed the battle from here, on the ridge just beyond the Bois Francais, and describe it in his memoirs as a sunlit picture of hell. In the centre, the units of the 20th Brigade would attack over the difficult ground there and the valley below towards Mametz. And here, the 8th and 9th Battalion, the Devonshire Regiment, those veterans of Lewes, with the 2nd Gordon Highlanders who'd been fighting since the First Battle of Ypres in October 1914, would lead that assault. On the right was the 91st Brigade, where the 1st South Staffs would attack the village, with the 22nd Manchesters of the Manchester Powers on their right flank. In this right sector, no man's land was very narrow, a legacy of the earlier battles of the war when the Germans and the French had met here in the fields and the trench system had developed, and no man's land was only about 200, in fact less than 200 yards across. But the attack went well here, and the men quickly got into the German trenches, but then came under heavy fire from the village itself and also from a German trench, Danzig Alley, on the rise across to their right. Despite this, and despite some heavy losses amongst those assault troops, the battalions were on their objectives in the first hour, and elements of the 1st South Staffs entered the ruins of Mametz village. But the Germans reacted, and gradually the attack came to a standstill between the village itself and Danzig Alley Trench. Because the artillery plan here was more flexible, fire was able to be brought back to assist with issues like this. In most parts of the front on the 1st of July, the artillery plan was written in stone. You could not call guns back to assist you if you ran into a hotspot of machine guns or mortars or enemy troop concentrations, but here they could do that. So Danzig Alley was then bombarded once more, and although progress was slow here, by 1 p.m. on the 1st of July, Danzig Alley was in British hands, and the village had been cleared by the 1st South Staffs and 21st Manchesters. On the left, the units of the 20th Brigade walked into heavy fire as the 8th and 9th Devons advanced from behind their front line. That became one of the classic stories of the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and a story that we've told here before, both on the podcast and the YouTube channel. But it was here the initial losses on the slopes and the Valley of No Man's Land would eventually lead to the creation of what became known as the Devonshire Cemetery, where men from those battalions, the 8th and 9th Devons, were all buried together in one communal burial ground. And sadly, men who had predicted their own death here, if not all the German defences had been silenced, were proved true and were amongst those buried in that newly created Devonshire Cemetery. Despite this, they and the 2nd Gordon Highlanders on their right pushed on and overrun the Germans before they could properly react. However, losses slowed down their attack, and by late morning they were still clearing their way through the myriad of German trenches that approached the village itself. Units meant to form a flank on the left, with the units attacking Fricourt, were unable to do that because of what was happening there and part of the failure of that attack, and this part of the battle here around Mametz was less successful. Reinforcements were moved up, and the 2nd Battalion, Royal Warwickshire Regiment, moved forward to help the battle-scarred battalions, and by just after 4 p.m. on the 1st of July, the village of Mametz was totally in British hands, some Germans resisting to the last man, and the last round, and at the point of the bayonet too. The fighting was just as stiff at the end as it had been at 0 hour. The line was held. The Oldham Pioneers, assisted by all of the field companies of the Royal Engineers within the 7th Division, moved up into Mametz, wired up the position to give it protection, and helped consolidate that position as well, and it meant that the captured positions could be held against any potential German counterattacks. The village was now a strong point under the command of the commanding officer of the 21st Manchesters. They had captured wells in the village which supplied water to quench the thirsts of the men on that hot 1st of July. Communications were secure from battlefield to rear echelon, and medical facilities had come forward to receive and treat the wounded from their main dressing station at the nearby Minden post. So while the advance at Mametz had not proceeded entirely as hoped, the ground approaching Mametz Wood and a proper defensive line was secure. A link-up with the attacking units around Montauban had been made, and the enemy badly mauled by the battle. The Reserve Infantry Regiment No. 109 had lost over 2,000 officers and men, and the shattered remains of that regiment were pulled out of the line on the night of the 1st of July. Total casualties in the 7th Division making this attack here at Mametz were 3,380 officers and men killed, wounded and missing, with over 1,000 men of that total killed, about 1 in 3. It had been a tough day at Mametz. To the east of Mametz was the village of Montauban de Picardy. Slightly larger than Mametz, it sat on a ridgeline with the brickworks to the southeast and 2 woods immediately to the east of the village, Bernafay and Trones Wood as they were marked on British maps. Opposite Montauban were 2 villages in British hands, Carnoy, Carnoy and Maricourt, the sectors there separated by a strip of woodland known as the Talus Boisé. Beyond Maricourt were the French, so this sector was the extreme right flank of the British Army on the whole Western Front, and where those 2 great allies met. The Germans holding Montauban were Bavarians, with some Silesians as well, and the unit which largely defended this sector on the 1st of July was the Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment No. 6. They'd been on the Somme for some time, and like their neighbours in Mametz, knew the ground here well. They had very deep dugouts. There are photographs of their dugouts in Ande Somme, one of the photo books that was published in 1916, showing these massive dugouts with huge steps coming down into them. So they were well sheltered, well below ground, and they had a long valley behind the village to protect their artillery. That's Caterpillar Valley, and the position of Montauban gave it dominance towards Carnoy and Maricourt, where the British were. The units who would go into the attack here on the first day of the Battle of the Somme were part of the British 13th Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Walter Congreve, VC. Congreve had been commissioned in 1880 and had been awarded the Victoria Cross for bravery at Colenso in 1899. In 1914 he was a brigade commander, he'd commanded a division by 1915, and by the end of that year was a corps commander. His son William Congreve was serving with the Rifle Brigade and later as a brigade major, and would be awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross on the Somme just a few weeks into the battle, one of 3 pairs of fathers and sons to achieve that distinction of both of them being awarded the Victoria Cross. Congreve's corps was a new army formation with the 18th Eastern Division to attack from Carnoy and the 30th Division from Maricourt, with the 9th Scottish Division in reserve. So who were these divisions? Well, the 18th Eastern Division was a kind of home counties division. It was from the Eastern Command area of the British Army. So it had units like the Norfolks and the Sussex, the Essex, the Royal Berkshires, the Royal Sussex, the Royal Fusiliers, Middlesex, Northamptonshires, Bedfordshires, Queen's Royal West Surreys, the East Kents, the Royal West Kents and the East Surreys as well. So they were drawn largely from that kind of southeast to eastern area of Britain in terms of geography, and while none of these were POWs battalions as such, quite a few of them were raised in regions, in areas, so they would affect a wider community if there were heavy casualties. The neighbouring 30th Division was essentially a POWs division originally, made up of Liverpool and Manchester POWs, One of the brigades of the Manchester Pals had been moved into the 7th Division and, as we've just heard, took part in the attack at Mametz. The remaining Manchester battalions stayed with the 30th Division, and there were also 4 battalions of Liverpool Pals. And I think if you look to an example to typify what Pals units were about, the Liverpool and Manchester Pals, I think, really are it. In particular, Liverpool Pals, this private army raised by Lord Derby, a big Liverpool landowner who raised 4 battalions of these Pals in 1914, and he paid for everything. He paid for their recruitment, he paid for their billets and their training and their weapons and equipment and their uniforms, and he even paid their wages until the War Office eventually took them over in 1915. Now, officially, they were part of the King's Liverpool Regiment, whose cap badge was the White Horse of Hanover. But as Lord Derby had paid for the raising and establishment of this unit, he felt that it should have its own distinct badge, and he put forward the idea of adapting the Derby family coat of arms with a liver bird swooping over a child in a cradle and the family motto Sans Changer underneath. And he had more than 4,000 of these badges struck in solid silver, given to each man within each of the 4 battalions, from private to lieutenant colonel. And although they rather ungraciously nicknamed that cap badge the Duck and Bastard, I think they must have had some value in that badge, because over the years of collecting militaria, I've seen many of them where soldiers' names are engraved on the back, and when you read the accounts of Liverpool Pals, many of them left those badges behind as keepsakes with their mother, their wife, their sister, their girlfriend, whatever it was. And when they got to France, a dull bronze version of the badge was issued to them on active service before they got steel helmets. So that unit had originally been composed of these Pals battalions, but in 1915 some of the Manchesters were removed and a number of regular battalions were brought in. It was thought within some of the hierarchy of the British Expeditionary Force that some of these new army divisions were not strong enough in their training, in their command, and there was this kind of thought that because they were citizen soldiers, they were men who'd been civilians just a few months before, really. They weren't proper soldiers, and you needed to bolster up a unit like that with regular battalions. I mean, they demonstrated what they were able to do in the coming battle and many other battles besides, but that was the kind of mindset of many of those in the army at that time. So the 18th, a new army unit drawn from mainly the southeast and eastern part of Britain. The 30th, predominantly Pals, but with some regular battalions. The 9th Scottish Division, who was in reserve, would not go over the top on the first day, but would be ready to exploit the next phase of the advance when that came, was also a new army unit, part of what was called the first 100,000, the first 100,000 men to join Kitchener's army in 1914. They too had taken part in operations before. The division had gone into action on the first day of the Battle of Loos in September 1915 and suffered terrible casualties in the fighting for the Hohenzollern Redoubt, including losing its divisional commander killed in that battle. And some of the Scottish units had suffered such heavy casualties that they were disbanded, and one of its brigades in 1916 was replaced with the South African Brigade. 4 battalions of South African infantry brought over from South Africa and used for the first time on the Western Front as part of this division, and they would go into action a few weeks later in the battle for Delville Wood, which the treetops of which could be seen vaguely in the distance from the outskirts of Maricourt village, for example. But that battle was yet to come, and those South African lads would have had no idea that that's where this Somme journey would be taking them. The artillery assets of all these 3 divisions were to be part of the bombardment. So although the 9th Scottish was actually not involved in the main assault, its artillery units were part of the preliminary bombardment. And that with heavy artillery from the Royal Garrison Artillery, plus Stokes mortars firing at close range in the vanguard of the assault, and medium and heavy trench mortars manned by the Royal Field Artillery and Royal Garrison Artillery, who were assisting, plus multiple artillery units from the neighbouring French 20th Corps on their flank, meant that the Allied artillery here outnumbered the German guns by something like 4-1. And that showed in how they were able to affect the outcome of the battle here on the 1st of July and the level of casualties they can inflict on the enemy and how they could damage his defences. And it became one of the predominant lessons, really, of this opening stage of the Somme in July 1916, the power and importance of artillery. The plan for the assaulting divisions was to secure the village of Montauban on the ridgeline, link up with the units on their left near Mametz and the French on their right who were attacking Hardycourt, and then, depending on the success of the fighting between Fricourt and the Albert-Bapaume road, to push on into the hinterland beyond Montauban, with talk of taking villages like Guillemont along the way. The 18th Eastern Division attack was on the left from Carnoy towards the Mametz Montauban road. They were not going right into Montauban village itself. They were attacking the ground just to the left of Montauban to secure that part of the ridge line between Mametz and Montauban villages. Here they would roll up key defences like Montauban Alley Trench and the Pommier Redoubt, secure a link-up with the troops attacking Mametz, and then link with the POWs in the 30th Division, who were going into action just beyond the divisional boundary of that strip of woodland called the Talus Boisé. There was good liaison with the artillery, and the barrage to assist with the attack was to be in multiple stages, including a rolling shrapnel barrage in front of the assault troops to protect them in the advance on the high ground between those two villages. This early use of a creeping barrage, a rolling barrage, to assist the infantry in their attack. Pioneers from the Divisional Pioneer Battalion, the 8th Royal Sussex Regiment, and also the division's field companies of the Royal Engineers would go forward to create strong points in the captured lines to ensure they could be defended against any German counterattacks. It was decided not to use smoke in this sector, as some of the staff officers who were planning this battle had taken part in the Battle of Loos in 1915, had experienced smoke at Loos, and saw it as a bit of a mixed blessing, so a decision was made not to use it here. However, Russian saps had been prepared on the whole corps front by the 183rd Tunnelling Company of the Royal Engineers. They were not just placing mines, they were digging these tunnels underneath no man's land with charges to blow the far end, or in some cases to blow the entire roof off, creating an instant trench. So you could dig across no man's land towards a German trench, blow one of these Russian saps from end to end, blow the roof off, and create an instant communication trench that, with a bit of extra digging, would link your front line with the German front line, and you could send men safely through it to reinforce. Other types just involve the far end of the tunnel, the sap being blown and men emerging via a ramp from there and getting quickly out into no man's land and shortening the distance that they had to advance. And also on the 18th Eastern Division sector, these tunnellers had prepared 2 mines, including a £5,000 charge under the Casino Point position, where there was a strong point. A large Livens flame projector was also scheduled to assist with the assault here too, to lay down a flame barrage in the final phase of the attack, and the 18th Eastern Division were led in this assault for the first time as a divisional commander by Major General Ivor Maxey. This was his first battle commanding a division in the field, and he would go on to prove to be one of the most able British commanders of the Great War, ending the conflict as Inspector General of Training of the whole British Army, really changing the way that the British, helped change the way that the British fought its battles on the Western Front in 1917-18. He'd chosen to have all 3 brigades from his division in the line from left to right, with battalions from each of those brigades leading the advance in each brigade sector. So it wasn't that all of the battalions were going to go into action simultaneously. Some went forward with others behind. The mine went off at Casino Point and caused some casualties to the 6th Royal Berkshires, and as the advance began, the units in the attack found that not everything worked in the way that it had been planned, and this became a big lesson for Maxey and many others that day. Many strong points had survived the bombardment intact, and machine gun fire caught many of the battalions in the open. Even when you visit that ground today, you can see how open that ground between Mametz and Montauban is. There's almost no cover, not many dips in the rolling chalk downland of that area. So if you're advancing in the open in broad daylight, which they were on the 1st of July, and there are surviving machine guns, then they can play merry hell with your advance. It was an area made famous by one company of the 8th East Surreys, close to the Talus Boisé, under the command of Captain Billy Neville, who kicked footballs into battle, the ultimate expression of playing the game. And the barrage here, while well thought out, was less flexible than at Mametz, and many of the battalions watched covering artillery fire, that creeping barrage, disappear into the distance, unable to bring it back. Despite this, and the hard fighting in the German lines, by late afternoon, the ground between Mametz and Montauban was secure, and Montauban Alley Trench was in British hands along with the Pommier Redoubt. But losses were high, and many units were now intermingled, holding the ground that they'd captured. And as the Sussex Pioneers and the sappers from the field companies came up to help consolidate, to wire up the trenches that had been captured, to stop the Germans from getting in, to help build strong points in those captured positions, that evening a German counterattack came in from Caterpillar Valley, and it was beaten back. This part of the battlefield had been won at the cost of over 3,100 casualties in the 18th Eastern Division that day, demonstrating to men like Ivor Maxey, commanding the division, that even with success came losses. On the far side of the Talus Boisé, the units of the 30th Division made their attack at 0 hour, 7:30 a.m, with Stokes mortars firing from the Russian saps, and when the first wave went forward, from left to right, the 18th King's Liverpool Regiment, the 19th Manchesters, the 20th King's Liverpools, and the 17th King's Liverpools on the border with the French of the 39th Division, veterans of Coke 304 at Verdun. It was here that Lieutenant Colonel Fairfax, commanding that 17th King's Liverpool Regiment, and Commandant Le Petit of the 3e Battalion of the 153rd Regiment of Infantry, went across no man's land together in a symbol of Allied cooperation. Despite some losses from the machine gun fire, especially on the left flank near the Talus Boisé, where the 18th King's Liverpool went into battle, within an hour the village had been taken. And like in the 18th Eastern Division sector, the divisional pioneers, in this case from the 11th South Lancs and the Royal Engineer Field Companies of the 30th Division, moved up to help consolidate the village of Montauban that had been captured. In the afternoon, heavy shell fire from the Germans came down on these captured positions, and units on the left flank assisted neighbouring units in the fighting for Montauban Alley, and patrols to the east found Bernafay Wood empty, but no decision was ever made what to do about that. It was a potential missed opportunity. The wooded areas just east of the village, not occupied by the Germans nowhere to be seen, but there wasn't the battle reserves to exploit that, and no clear intelligence could be relayed back to enable, for example, units of the 9th Scottish Division to move up and exploit that situation. It was a lost opportunity. The brickworks on the flanks of both the British and the French were taken by the 20th King's Liverpool Regiment, and the attack here had been successful. It just wasn't possible to push on because of the outcome of the battle along the rest of the line beyond Montauban. Manchester Powers battalions moved up and then defended the ground beyond the village, looking down into Caterpillar Valley and across to Longueval on the skyline and that horseshoe of woods. From there they could see Delville Wood, and they could see the trees of High Wood, and down the far end of Caterpillar Valley the big mass of Mametz Wood as well. The attack had cost that 30th Division just over 3,000 casualties, and again it demonstrated how victory would only ever be won at a cost in men's lives, the sad reality of these battles of the Great War. For the Germans, this was one of their most costly 1st of July battlefields, with the Bavarians and the Silesians losing over 1,800 officers and men. But a captured diary that was taken indicated that may well actually have been over 3,000 casualties in this area, making it really the most costly part of the battlefield from the German point of view, if that's true. What the largely successful fighting at Mametz and Montauban on the 1st of July 1916 showed was that the capture and holding of enemy positions was possible, but that one of the keys to it was artillery. By this stage of the conflict, artillery was both king and queen of the battlefield. An infantry unit on the ground was only as good as the guns that supported it, and an attack was only possible if the artillery was able to do its job and have numbers, as was here, that ratio of 4-1 in outnumbering the enemy's guns. That's no coincidence that enabled success to happen here on this battlefield. The strength of the bombardment, the use of heavy artillery, of which there are much greater numbers of heavy guns here at Montauban, plus mortars and wire cutting, were all part of the orchestra of artillery now needed to achieve success on the battlefield. And the early use of these creeping, rolling barrages here had also been successful, and it was something that General Congreve, the Corps Commander, would use again here in his next major attack on the 14th of July. The necessity for infantry training also emerged here, something that Maxey, of course, would go on to really define. Rather than just get men to practice on white tapes and roll around to the sound of drums indicating rolling barrages or machine gun fire, it was better to train soldiers to fight in, clear trenches, and more importantly, mop up those trenches to ensure that the Germans didn't suddenly pop up behind you. And that was very effective, in particular at Montauban with the Liverpool and Manchester POWs, and was really the key to holding a position once it was captured. And I think also the implementation on this front from Mametz to Montauban of pioneers, the pioneer battalions of the division, and Royal Engineer field companies was really important, because rather than just get the assault troops to go forward with tools to dig their own positions, prepare their own defences, do their own wiring, you sent specialist troops forward, battlefield pioneers from the Pioneer Infantry Battalion and specialists from a field company of the Royal Engineers to go forward to wire up the positions that had been captured, create strong points and machine gun positions and observation posts. And that use of those specialist troops in this way was significant, I think, in the outcome of these battles. On other parts of the front, they were used, but often they went forward in the first wave carrying Bangalore torpedoes, which were charges to place under wire to blow a lane in them, and very often they were just cut down by machine gun fire in those sectors. But here they played a much bigger role in the outcome of battle. The achievements in this southernmost sector of the Somme was in many ways poor compensation for the loss of over 57,000 casualties along the entire Somme front on that terrible first day of the Somme. But it had given the British a foothold in the German line, one that would be exploited and enlarged in the coming weeks. This Somme success would be where the battle would be carried forward. The battle in the south was different to the rest of the 1st of July story. There'd been loss, but there was something to show for it. In the fighting between Mametz and Montauban, total losses had exceeded 6,100 officers and men killed, wounded and missing, a casualty figure equalled by many single divisions that day, and while far from small, indicated lessons to men like Maxey and Congreve, the corps commanders, that you could win on the field of battle, but the roll of honour would always be long. That was the reality they would have to face for the rest of the war. Back in the 80s and 90s, I interviewed a number of men who served here with both the 18th Eastern Division and 30th Division, including some veterans of the POWs battalions from Liverpool and Manchester. And it was always interesting to hear how they framed their experience here compared to men who'd been in units wiped out at places like Serres or Beaumont-Hamel and La Boisselle. None of the men I interviewed had been wounded here on the first day. They'd seen mates killed and wounded, but 1st of July 1916 was just their first day on the Somme, not their last. And for some, like Paddy Kennedy MM in the Manchester POWs, he had bigger battles ahead in Trones Wood, for example. And as we've done with the other sectors that we've looked at by breaking this 1st of July front up into 3 areas, we might consider a virtual walk across that part of the battlefield to understand it as it is today. And in this area between Mametz and Montauban, we'll start just opposite the Bois Français on that ridge which overlooks Fricourt in one direction and Mametz and Montauban beyond it in the other direction. And we'll approach it from the British side, if you like, coming up towards the wooded area itself. Within that woodland today are the remains of trenches and shell holes and mine craters, much of it on private land, but not difficult to see, particularly in the spring and in the winter. And this is the beginning of this sector in terms of the 1st of July story. And you can walk along a track that takes you past, running parallel to that wooded area, out to the areas where the front lines had stabilised in the early period of the war, where there'd been mining activities, where Siegfried Sassoon had won his military cross in a trench raid, gone out to pick up a wounded soldier and brought him back in. And then you come out at the far end on a very high point there with incredible views, and you can drop down a track towards the Devonshire Cemetery and take those steps up past the memorial from the 1980s that records that famous legend. The Devonshires held this trench, the Devonshires hold it still. Swing open the bronze gates and see those lines of graves marking that comrade cemetery, all but a couple of the burials in there from the Devonshire Regiment, and many, many fascinating stories from William Noel Hodgson, the poet, through to Duncan Martin, the possible spy, an incredible enigma, men that we've spoken about in previous podcasts on that subject. But a great place to stop and think and connect, I think, with that landscape of the Great War within the solitude of that Devonshire cemetery. And then from there you can drop down towards the Peron Road. Over to your right is the Gordon Cemetery. We spoke about the Gordon Hunters going into action alongside the Devonshire lads. They have their own little battlefield cemetery there, a circular collection of graves. It was said that the men were buried in a large shell hole, but that may not be entirely true. But you can follow the path up into and towards Mametz village, get to the position known as the Shrine, which was a French civilian cemetery on the edge of Mametz, where there were a number of machine gun positions in that area, and you could stand there and look back and see the incredible fields of fire that the Germans had from the outskirts of Mametz village. You can walk on into the village itself. You come to a crossroads where if you went straight over, that would take you towards Contalmaison, and you'd veer off and go to Mametz Wood. And just to the right, as you turn right here to go towards Danzig Alley Cemetery, is an elongated building there which once was the village cafe. It's no longer a cafe. It hasn't been a cafe for many, many years. But my old pal John Dray, a Devonshire man who had served with the Northamptonshire Regiment at Monte Cassino, in the 50th anniversary of the Great War, from 64 to 68, he came over every year with a group of veterans that were sent over by the Royal British Legion, and him and the driver were the only non-Great War veterans on those coaches. And in 1966, he came here to the village of Mametz on the 1st of July, and at the back of his coach, he had half of a platoon of Manchester POWs, men who had captured this village on the first day of the Somme, the platoon commander, the platoon sergeant, and some of the men. And he always told me this story every time we went to Mametz together, that they'd gone into the bar to get a bit of refreshment on that hot summer's day, and the officer sat with him at one of the tables while the old platoon sergeant lined the men up at the bar and gradually got them served with a beer. And the officer said to John, "See that man at the bar, Dre? He was my platoon sergeant, a damn fine man in a tight corner." And John always used to say to me, "What an epitaph for a soldier, a damn fine man in a tight corner. There isn't a better one." And every time I pass that building, now a private residence, they probably have no idea what happened in there, I think of old John Boy and I think of those veterans. What an incredible moment, a platoon returning to its old objective 50 years later. And on the outskirts of the village, you will come to Danzig Alley Cemetery, where many of the fallen from the first day of the Somme, from this attack and some of the neighbouring ones, are buried. It was a place that I often used to go to on the 1st of July when I was living on the Somme and look for somewhere a bit different, perhaps, to go and commemorate that terrible day, that fateful day in 1916. And then from there, you can drop down on a local road into Carnoy. go up via the Talus Boisé. You can follow a track out of the village to the edge of the Talus Boisé, that long strip of woodland, and then come up to another track where Billy Neville went over the top with the Surreys and where they kicked their footballs. Cross over from the far end of the Talus Boisé into the 30th Division, the POW sector at Maricourt, and then walk via the two areas of woodland that are marked on British trench maps, and the layout there is pretty much unchanged since 1916, so you can go via Machine Gun Wood and Germans Wood up into the outskirts of Montauban, following that POW's advance. On the crossroads there, you'll see the POW's Memorial with the symbol, the Duck and Bastard cap badge, the Liverpool POW's cap badge on the front, and the Manchester cap badge on the back. And then when you walk straight across, go out to the very edge of Montauban village to a kind of sunken lane that disappears off to the right, and you're on the spot where the Manchester POWs defended that ground and where Paddy Kennedy MM was with his mates on the evening of the 1st of July. Busy beating off a German attack with rifle fire, but looking towards Caterpillar Valley and Longueval, and they could see the trees of Bernafay Wood, and just beyond that the pear shape of Trones Wood, a name they didn't yet know, but within a few days that would be their battlefield, their place on that part of the Somme. For many at both Mametz and Montauban, this was their last day of the Somme. They became casualties here, falling on the field of battle. But for others, this was just the start. Just like Paddy Kennedy, it was the start of a long battle, and in some cases, a long war. But for the new army battalions and the POWs from Liverpool and Manchester, this was their first time in action, and this ground would hold special significance for them, a place to reflect on their wider war and the cost to them and their mates, their comrades, along that old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.